Welcome to the Wisconsin Veterans Home tonight. It's this afternoon, actually, and isn't it great summer weather? So, we're the Wild Rose Community Band. What you just heard was probably something you're familiar with. The theme from the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. It's a real short little thing, but it's a good way to kick off our program today, we thought. So thank you for braving the cool weather. I see everybody found their jacket. Yes, and blanket in some cases, right? So thank you for doing that. This is live streamed on Facebook right now by our friend Ken Walker from Oshkosh there on the table. Thank you, Ken. He does this out of the goodness of his heart, and he loves doing it, apparently. So thank you very much for that. So, our program will begin. All right, with the national anthem conducted by John Jenks. So please, if you're able, stand and on your heart. Thank you.
Thundercrest Concert March by Eric Osterling. This rousing march was written by Eric Osterling when he was in high school as a teacher in Connecticut. The music is broad, sweeping, and you can see the thunderstorm approaching across the plains with thundering low brass and percussion. Then the light rain of the woodwinds, followed again by thundering percussion, low brass, and trumpets. Of course, the most vulnerable of all instruments, the trombone, is featured throughout. So let's enjoy Thundercrest March. Called Overture for Winds by Charles Carter. Charles Carter composed Overture for Winds in the year 1959. This piece provides great challenges to both the performer and the audience members. The performers must execute tempo, dynamics, and articulation changes without, quote, giving away abrupt shifts to the audience. For the audience, the piece can seem like a roller coaster ride of changes, shifting between fast and slow, yet seamlessly gaining strength and driving toward a brilliant close. We hope you enjoy Overture for Winds.
All right. Randall Standridge is a recent composer, leaving his post as director of high school bands in Arkansas in 2013 to compose full-time. He has had numerous works published, and Ascension is one of his personal reflections. Ascension is a hymn song, a study of the composer's own mortality, moments of faith, doubt, and wonder, all marking experiences in our lives. This is a beautiful, sometimes mournful, sometimes stately song. Ascension by Randall Standridge. Our next song, Into the Storm, by Robert Smith, takes us to the skies once again. The beginning keeps us off balance. The thunder, rain, lightning everywhere. But then we glide into the eye of the storm, and as the storm passes, the sun breaks through the clouds, only to once again succumb to the storm. Again the wind rises, the rain falls, and the thunder returns the storm to us. And once again, as always happens, the sun breaks through. Into the Storm by Robert Smith.
Shostakovich wrote many, many pieces. He was quite a prolific composer. But perhaps the one that will stick in your mind is one he formerly entitled Suite for Jazz Orchestra No. 2, well known as Waltz No. 2. The second waltz, Beautiful Haunting Melody, is arranged for band by James Kurnow. That most lovely and perfect of all instruments, the trombone, takes a solo in the middle of the piece. James Kurnow was born and raised in Michigan. I think God's getting even with me, I think. Okay, raised in Michigan, receiving his initial training in music from the Salvation Army. He has written and arranged nearly 100 songs. Waltz No. 2 by Dmitri Shostakovich.
Did you catch it?
Our next piece is entitled Quicksilver by William Owens. It's also registered as what we refer to in music as a gallop, which creates a whimsical atmosphere of the circus. Quicksilver is another name for Mercury, and it is an appropriate title for this march composed by William Owens. Owens was born in Gary, Indiana, and has written nearly 200 commissioned and published works for band. Quicksilver was written just 8 years ago and showcases the talents of Owens. Hang on to your chairs. A Gallop Quicksilver by William Owens.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Such an honor for us to be able to be in your presence this afternoon. The Veterans Home holds a very special place in my heart. My father served in World War II at the base of the Himalayan mountains from 1944 to 1946. And when the war was done and the troop ship was heading across the Pacific Ocean, he said the most beautiful sight that he had ever seen at that point in his life was the Golden Gate Bridge, because he knew that he would soon be home to his wife and little daughter, my sister actually. And so it's such a special honor for us to perform for you today. The composition that the band will be performing is entitled As Summer Was Just Beginning, but since it's ending, we renamed it As Summer Is Just Ending. I know, we're pretty crafty at any rate. It's written by a dear friend of John's and I, Larry Dan. Larry lives in New Glarus, and he's been our friend since we moved to Wisconsin in 1980. It's a beautiful piece. It's dedicated to the memory of the actor James Dean, who died very prematurely in a car accident accident when he was only 24 years old. He died in 1955. Posthumously, he won 2 Academy Awards. So we are honored again to perform for you the beautiful work by Larry Dan entitled As Summer Was Just Beginning or Ending.
It is now time to honor our veterans with a piece arranged by our own Mike Van Pelt. It's called the Service Marches. The percussion section will start this piece with a roll-off, and we ask veterans, if you are able, stand proudly and be recognized when the march of your branch of the service is played. If you're not able to stand, wave to us. We would like to see you. We thank you all for your service to our country. You defended our country against fascism and communism all over the world. And we honor you today. Thank you. And as Dan said earlier, no concert is complete without a Sousa March. John Philip Sousa, the March King, is undeniably just that, the king of the march. The Liberty Bell March was written in 1893 as part of an unfinished operetta. At the time, the song was unnamed, but while at the Columbia Exposition in Chicago, band manager George Hinton suggested the name Liberty Bell upon seeing a backdrop of the Liberty Bell. This march is perhaps best known as the theme for Monty Python's Flying Circus, but has been played at many presidential inaugurations. I'm sure you're going to recognize it as soon as you hear it. Liberty Bell by John Philip Sousa. It has been such a joy to perform for you this afternoon. Thank you so much for coming, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Our final song, On Wisconsin. Clap, jump up and down, whatever you would love to do. So thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.